Are you planning on getting married and wondering about the money side of things, where to start, how to manage expenses, how to save money? Well, joining me to discuss those topics is CJ Miller, a financial planner with Sensible Money, who, among other things, is planning his own wedding as we speak. CJ, welcome.
Hi, Bob. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you here. So, where should couples start the wedding planning process?
Well, I think it starts like with any big financial decision, is making a budget. So, the budget is going to give you framework to make those big decisions about the specifics of your wedding. And so without that framework, it becomes very difficult to have hard discussions and make the choices that you want to make to have the best wedding possible. So for instance, if you want your dream wedding and you want to have 300 people there and you want to have all of the bells and whistles, you might have to have a bigger budget and decide to get married a little bit later and to spend more time saving money so that you're on sound financial footing. Because I think the biggest risk with getting married is that you get so caught up in the moment that by the end of it, you end up in debt or severely depleting your financial assets to the point where you're kind of starting off your married life on rocky footing.
So part of it, obviously, I remember when I was getting married, there were certain trade-offs, not only in terms of the number of people, but also all the other things that go along with the costs associated with the wedding, whether it's a band or how much food or how much liquor, for instance. So talk a little bit about the trade-offs that people have to sort of analyze and prioritize, I suppose.
I think the biggest decision trade-off wise is the size of the wedding. And that's going to really escalate your cost. If you decide to have 50 people versus 100 people, you're going to save a lot of money. And so I kind of think about it as put together the big contracts first. You want to be in a position where you know what the big rocks are. So you know your venue, you know your caterer, and you know how many people are going to be there. And then things like the band and the alcohol, you can wiggle around your budget as you start to plan those smaller items because you already have the big things accounted for. But you will get hit with random surprise expenses that you didn't think you'd have. I've learned there's hundreds of wedding blogs with all these different ideas. My fiance reads them. I'm not as avid. But, we're always having discussions about things I would never have thought about. And so you really have to decide what's most important to you and make compromises. We decided not to have a videographer, for instance, because we have a lot of friends there that are going to have new iPhones, which is, like movie quality filming now. But instead I wanted a live band. And so we spent a little extra on that.
Right. And how important is it that you create some sort of timeline to, I guess, make sure that everything is getting done in the manner in which it needs to be done to have it go smoothly?
Well, I think it's crucial. Most vendors are going to charge you a deposit, and then they're going to have break points, especially for the big ones. So then you're going to owe 50%, 6 weeks before the wedding. And so you can sign all those contracts 18 months out and say, okay, I'm going to save enough money to be able to pay those off by the time they come due. But if you sign too many contracts and you're not really keeping a close eye on it, when those bills come due, you might not have the money. So I think having a sustainable timeline is really important. There are a lot of websites that'll help you manage not only your budget, but your timeline. My fiance gives me homework and says, okay, we need to have our ceremony down by January 1st. You need to have your groomsmen send in their measurements for their rentals by this date. And so we use the knot.com, which is a great resource for crafting a budget and also making sure you're not missing some of the smaller items that can sneak up on you.
Right. And then in terms of managing expenses along the way, you mentioned vendor contracts. What advice do you have there?
Well, I think you have to be willing to negotiate a little bit, and I do think it's a little rude to be like, give me your full package and everything you offer at a discount for no reason. I think a better approach is to go to, a lot of the vendors will have a variety of options and packages. And so you may see a silver package and a gold package and kind of want something in between. Like for our photographer, for instance, we didn't need the full gold package, full 9 yards, but, we did want a second photographer there to capture different angles. And so instead of thinking that we had to splurge and spend the extra, a few $1,000s for the gold package, we just had a conversation about it and say, hey, can we do the silver and then add in the second photographer and kind of meet in the middle? And she was totally fine with that. And so you have to be willing to have those conversations. I think another big cost savings is if you decide to get married on a day that's not Saturday. So we moved our wedding to Friday, and we got an automatic 25% discount from our venue. And we're still getting married in March, which is prime wedding season here in Arizona. And it works out because so many of our guests are flying in anyway, that in this day and age, as long as you give them enough notice, they should be able to take that day off of work. And I think everybody's happy to save a little bit of money moving it to a Friday or a Sunday.
You talked about unexpected items. What sort of, what should people be prepared to spend on when it comes to unexpected items?
Well, I think for a lot of vendors, you think a lot of things are included, and it makes it hard to shop around for the big items like the vendors, because you may go to a hotel and they'll quote you a price and they'll say, this is it for a 100-person wedding at this room. And then you really read the details, and like, it doesn't include like forks or, so you're in this position where it's like, oh, okay, I budgeted in the base price, but then it doesn't include any food. It doesn't include the wedding coordinator. It doesn't include the flowers. So, we're in a position, we just hired a day of coordinator, and she's asking us all these questions. And she's doing a great job to take things off our plate. But like, a lot of the vendors didn't even mention things. My fiance Michaela's been on top of it, but like flowers on the table, I never would have thought about that. Or we rented an arch for the ceremony. And so it's like, oh, do you want flowers on that? Now the florist is asking us questions like that I never would have anticipated would cost extra money. So you're basically, if you say yes to everything, you're going to exceed your budget in like a day.
Yeah. So just a joke, but on your wedding invitation, I suspect it doesn't say bring your own fork, BYOF. So talk also about the ability to pay up front, and I guess the benefits that come with that, either in terms of the psychological benefits or perhaps even the discounts that come by paying things up front versus over time.
Well, certain vendors, especially in COVID years, and I anticipate this will continue for the next few years as vendors start to try to make up revenue. But we got engaged right in April, and so we started wedding planning in the midst of COVID when a bunch of spring weddings had just gotten canceled. And so a lot of vendors were very willing to lock us in on pricing and give us a COVID clause in our contract, but also give us a discount if we paid up front, because they were losing out on revenue. And so a lot of vendors are willing to do that. Anybody who needs to be there live will probably do that. And I think the psychological benefit of it is, like I was mentioning before, if you sign all these contracts and don't pay $1 down, then when those bills come due, they could be a big hit. And, in a 6-month period, you also need to be measuring your lifestyle expenses. How much are you going out to eat? You may not be thinking that you have an extra mortgage payment coming, but it's going to feel like it when all those bills come due. So it's important that if you pay it up front, you don't have that money sitting in your checking account waiting to be spent on other things. It kind of just keeps it out of your mind. So it's kind of like paying yourself first, except you're paying your wedding vendors first.
Right. So it strikes me, if you had to give one piece of advice to anyone, would it be to start saving now for a wedding that takes place much later, even though you may not have an idea of how much it will actually cost, but to have some sort of pot of money earmarked for wedding is probably well in advance is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's a decision you have to make with your partner, because for some people, it's way more important to have a fantastic honeymoon than it is to have a really big wedding. You can have a very affordable, cheap wedding that doesn't cost you 10 years to save up for, and it can be really nice. But you have to decide as a couple, is that the wedding that you want, or would you prefer to wait and start saving now? If you rush before you can get engaged, and let's say you're in a committed relationship and you rush to buy a house, for instance, that maybe is a little more expensive than you can afford, but you're able to make the down payment. Then when it comes time to start planning that wedding, you're not going to have the same flexibility that you would have had if you were a little more patient. So, I think in general, when you're younger, saving money is the right thing to do, because you never know when you're going to have opportunities that come up for things that you want to do. And saving for retirement is one thing. Some of that money is not as liquid, but saving for just money in a savings account or for intermediate term goals. If the wedding doesn't work out, you can always spend it on other things later on.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground, CJ. Anything that we haven't touched upon that you think would be worth mentioning?
Yeah, well, I think we've got a few savings tips that we can review. I already mentioned getting married on Friday or Saturday is a big saving, but adding cash funds to your gift registry is huge. A lot of guests won't like to give cash, but most online registries now will allow you to say, you know what, instead of buying me this toaster that I don't need, pay for my dance lessons. And so you can get some of those bells and whistles without actually having to pay for it, because I don't think there's anything sadder than leaving a wedding with credit card debt and, 50 items and appliances that you don't even have space for in your house or apartment. So I think that's a great alternative to a traditional gifting registry. And then the other option, especially if you're getting married at a corporate hotel, is using points on your honeymoon. So a lot of the big hotel chains will give you points in advance if you commit to getting married at their location, and you can use that to offset the cost of an international honeymoon or even just a smaller domestic honeymoon.
Those are great tips. Well, one last question, CJ. In this day and age, or certainly when I got married, it was common for the parents of the bride to pay largely for the wedding. What's changed over the years? Is that still common, or do you find that now today couples like yourself are chipping in or maybe footing the bill in its entirety?
Well, I think it really depends on the situation, like always, and it depends, it's the financial situation of your parents. And so I can just tell you personally, like we are footing a large portion of the bill. My fiance's mother was in a position to contribute. My mother was able to contribute some, but I can tell you that I think if we had more money within my family, they would have contributed more. And so I don't think it's something you want to depend on. But for a lot of parents, and for the parents listening, I would say make that known sooner rather than later, because if you come in at the last minute with a check, they may have already passed up on some of the things that they would have wanted to spend on extra and use that money for. So just be transparent about what you're willing to contribute up front, and I think it'll make the wedding planning process easier for everybody.